Hey, how's it going, seventh grade? It's the moment you've been all waiting for here. My friend JP has finally had a chance to sit down and talk to me, so he's going to tell you a little bit about what life is like in Africa, a little bit about his life, some of the other things that go with being a world traveler like my friend JP is. So, without any further ado, let's bring in JP. How's it going today, JP?
Good, good, good. Hi, seventh graders.
um, why don't you tell us a little bit about what your life is like back in Africa? What brought you to Vermilion? How some of the similarities and differences between the United States, because you've lived all over the United States too, and Africa.
Yeah, life in Africa is not entirely different actually from life in the United States. I mean, it depends where you live in Africa. But my life, I lived in a town. It's pretty interesting life. Had an education and decided to fly over to the United States to further my education. And yeah, I mean, it was a nice town, about 100,000 people. And
So about the
yeah,
same size as Sioux Falls.
yes, about the same size of Sioux Falls. Yeah.
What was the name of the town that you lived in?
I lived in Yaoundé. It's the capital of Cameroon, so it's pronounced Yaoundé. So
There you go. What were some of the schools like in Cameroon?
the Cameroon briefly is bilingual. It's English speaking and French speaking as well. The the school was pretty mixed. Different groups of people who were there. It was rigorous. It was rigorous. We had a lot of different coursework. I mean, we had to do some advanced coursework in chemistry, biology. So the educational curriculum system was rigorous, and it's very laid back. The students are encouraged to have fun, so it would be normal to every little break we have 20-minute breaks before another class. We have a 20-minute break, so it would be normal to see students running around, talking, playing soccer. I mean, it's a very laid back kind of educational atmosphere.
Do you start school like the same way we do here? About 6 years old up to 18, or when do you guys start there? Same sort of thing, or?
Yeah, we start kindergarten at 3 years old. So by the time you start, I guess, first grade here, that's correct. You'll be 5 or 6. So yeah, so it's the same. It's from 6 years old. The interesting thing, before you get to college, you have about 13 years of schooling. So I know in the United States, from first grade, you have 12 years, but in our school system, you have about 13 years. So I guess you have an extra year of education before you can go to college. And actually, some schools back home in Cameroon is 14 years because it's divided into two sections. You have 7 years where you go to the elementary, which would be first to seventh grade. So that would be an extra 2 years, and then when you're high school, will be about 3 years. So it's actually in some schools it's actually 14 years. I went through the 13-year track, but I knew some friends who did 14 years. So it's actually uh, the education system in Cameroon, before you go to the university level, you actually have an extra 2 years as compared to the United States.
That probably sounds like torture for some of the seventh graders out here right now. So what's a day like in school for a Cameroonian, say middle schooler or high school or something? When do you guys start school?
We will start school at 8 o'clock, and there would be at that age we'll only have three classes, which will be divided into a couple of sections. So mostly math, English, and English comprehension, and then French as well, since again Cameroon is a bilingual country. So French, English, English comprehension, and then you have some math divided into separate sections. So we start school at 8 and we're done by 3 o'clock.
Okay, and we'll get into some questions specific later, but what's like Cameroonian school lunch like? What do you guys do for
Oh,
lunch?
so in Cameroon, we have vendors. So as opposed to the United States, where you have a cafeteria when people go there, the cafeteria in the Cameroonian educational system is mostly for kids going to the high schools, and that's mostly will be found in boarding schools. So that's where you would have a cafeteria system, which I went to a boarding school, so I had the cafeteria system. But in the public school system, there usually is no cafeteria. So when it's time for lunch, the kids go to vendors. Usually their parents support them, giving them a little bit of money so then they can go and they can have lunch. A typical lunch would be what whether you're in a boarding school in Cameroon or the public school in Cameroon will kind of be similar as what American seventh graders would have. The difference, I would say, is we love beans. So, Cameroonians love beans. So a lot of beans, rice. Uh, we have donuts. We call them African donuts because they are made a little bit differently. The so yeah, so the African donuts, a lot of beans, a lot of rice. Then obviously, your fish or meat. So yeah,
Okay, so you're from Cameroon, went through school in Cameroon, but I know, in talking to you that you've sort of been all over Western Africa at least. So you want to tell us a little bit about some of the other places that you've been to?
I've been to Nigeria. I actually happen to be half Nigerian. My mom's from Nigeria, and I lived in Ghana for 2 years. Um, it's pretty much the same. There's not obviously the differences between some of these other countries is there's a language difference. So in Nigeria they'll speak another language. In Ghana they'll have another language they speak. But basically, and then the educational system, because I actually went to school in Ghana, it's a little shorter than that of Cameroon. But yeah, living in different African countries, besides the fact that the city structure is probably a little different, and then the culture of the people, the Cameroonian culture, Nigerian culture, there's specifics in that culture that are different from each country to each country. But it's the same. It's the same. Uh, we have the same. We collaborate the same way, and what ties, interestingly enough, one last thing, what ties Nigeria, Cameroon, and Ghana is that they also speak English. They happen to speak English as well. So that is one thing when you travel. It's kind of interesting to see those kind of languages where people speak kind of the same language. Obviously, the difference being in Cameroon we have French as well, which Nigeria and Ghana do not.
So you said something about the different languages too. Um, with Nigeria, with Ghana, Cameroon, a lot of Africa really, right? They speak English at least on some level. But what are some of the other languages that are spoken in Africa, some of the places that you've been? Like, what is another language that they speak in Nigeria, for example?
So in Nigeria, is spelled Igbo, Igbo. That's a big language spoken in Nigeria. Yoruba is spoken in Nigeria. That's another language. In Ghana, the first language in Ghana is actually the spelling is Tchwi, and it's the Ghanaian people pronounce it as Chi. So that's some of the language that's spoken.
And these are like indigenous languages um, that came from like native Ghanaians, not like as a result of colonization or anything like
No, this
that.
is no, this is language spoken from native. Um, native Ghanaians and Nigeria, the Igbo and the Yoruba, those are groups that have existed for an extremely long time.
Now, I feel like since this is a social studies class, it would maybe be interesting to find out whether or not growing up in the different school systems that you were involved in, did you spend a lot of time with like history and geography, studying the planet, or was it mostly like you had said earlier with the math, the different languages, and then the science stuff?
I started learning more about social studies. I did not learn a lot about social studies in seventh grade. Yeah, so I did not. I learned more about social studies when I went to high school. So, and then I did a lot of geography, intense history, learning about the, yeah, different planets and just different nations and the culture and the history of nations. But yeah, in seventh grade, the focal point was mostly math, English comprehension.
That sort of leads me to this next question here too, which um, in America and in Europe, you sort of learn a lot about other cultures because one of the things that Americans and Europeans especially sort of hold as a priority is the ability to travel around the world, experience different cultures. Is that something that is sort of common among African, especially Western African for your experience there, or do a lot of people that come from Western Africa kind of put down roots there and plan to stay in that region?
Um, Mobility among, meaning people moving from place to place in Africa, is it's not very common actually. Most people just live in their countries. So where we see that kind of mobility is mostly in African countries that have issues, where there's war or other difficult social issues. But yeah, for the most part, the your typical Cameroonian, your typical Nigerian or Ghanaian enjoys just has only has mobility in their own country. So they'll go from, for instance, for instance, the United States. So somebody from Texas would only be mobile by going maybe to South Carolina or um, Pittsburgh. So somewhere in the United States, just inside the same country. So in West Africa, most people just migrate or are mobile in their own countries. But there are some people who move who would travel because we have easy borders to travel from. So where you would see a lot of that mobility is in the borders. So for instance, the border between Cameroon and Nigeria, people living in that border would it's very common place to see them go to Nigeria and come back, go back and forth. So yeah.
That was going to lead me to another question here. So we've sort of seen, through our studies, we sort of looked at like what the map looks like, and in Western Africa, there are a lot of little countries there that are sort of all really close together, and then a couple of big countries in the area, Nigeria, Niger, some of these rather large countries, right? Do African countries have, let's say, friendly rivalries with each other? Like if you're Nigerian and do you sort of, not like in a mean way, but sort of like put down people from like Ghana or Togo or something like that, right? Does that sort of thing exist in Africa?
Absolutely. We do that, and as you asked, we do that in a friendly way. But yeah, we do. I mean, for example, Nigeria is the powerhouse of Africa. It has the most population. It's considered the economic powerhouse. It actually overtook South Africa. I don't know. Most of you seventh graders, you've heard about South Africa and the popularity of South Africa. Well, Nigeria is actually a bigger powerhouse than South Africa. So Nigerians turn to be very proud. They turn to be very proud, and yeah, they do rivalries. Obviously, with they being the powerhouse with all of their African counterparts. So, but yeah, I mean, I in Cameroon, I we would always tease people from Nigeria or Niger, and it was back and forth and Nigeria. Yeah, so it's friendly. Uh, it's mostly with sports as well, with soccer, particularly since that's the sport of the country, of the continent, I should say. And but yeah, it's very friendly. But yes, we do that.
All right. Now, before we get into these questions again, what brought you to the States? And if you sort of want to briefly talk about the different stops that you've made and sort of what you've done along the way, because you told me, well, I think was it in Pennsylvania where you
Yeah.
actually played football, like
Oh,
American
I
football?
was in Illinois.
Okay, yeah. If you want
Yeah.
to sort of talk about the different places that you stopped and sort of what you've thought about those places and if they compare or some of the similarities and differences between these places and Africa.
Um, I did stop in Illinois. I went for my undergrad in Illinois. I ended up graduating in a college in Pennsylvania, and I'm still currently doing my graduate level work at the University of South Dakota. I would say I mean, there's so much I could say. The what I can remember in terms of how it compares to Africa and everything, I would say is when I was in Illinois, I lived in a little village. It's called Elsa. It's really 500 people, and it was absolutely comparable because everybody knew each other. Everybody would take care of each other. It also happened to be a religious community, and in Cameroon, we're mostly Catholic, and in a lot of African countries, religion is very important. So, and it's a way for people to communicate together, dialogue, share together. And in Elsa in Illinois, I was able to experience that. So I, yes, that was I felt at home in a sense. And so yeah, so there's just a last thing. There's a lot of similarities with the United States. I mean, towns, the people, and how the people communicate and interact. I mean, we have that all the time back home. So I thought that really made me feel at home.
One of the things that probably a lot of the seventh graders want to know, and touching back on that American football thing, right? When you played that, like when you were growing up in Cameroon, did anybody ever talk about NFL, American football, any of that stuff, or was it kind of just something that wasn't really a thing? Because in America, it's what I bet right now in the seventh grade class there are probably at least 5 kids that have a football shirt of some kind on, right?
No, no, the NFL, I never ever heard of it, and which is interesting too, because I have family members who live in the States who had lived here for a while and who would come back and visit my sisters and my cousins and I. But no, when I came to this country, that was the first time I realized how much the NFL is really a big sport. It's almost like uh, an American pastime. I mean, people really watch the NFL a lot. No,
People,
yeah, go ahead.
they live and die by it here for the
Correct.
most part, myself excluded. Now, before we get into these questions, I do have to ask you about this too. So we know that Cameroon is, right near the equator in the tropical zone there. So what was it like the first time that you experienced snow?
It was difficult. It was very difficult and painful. It doesn't really get that cold in Cameroon, so I would just in Cameroon the coldest we will get is a 40-degree weather. For us that's really cold. That's 40 degrees. That's really cold. So it doesn't get cold at all. So the first time I experienced snow, it it was really bad. Of course, now I'm used to it. But yeah, that was it wasn't. a good experience, to put it that way.
All right, let's get to some of the questions here from the seventh graders. So, first question is from Wyatt, and Wyatt asks, "What is your favorite food from Western Africa?" So, you talked about how beans were sort of a staple food that everybody likes, but can you think of like a particular dish or something that is one of your favorite from Western Africa, and one that you probably really miss because you don't really get to experience it too much unless you have some potlucks or something like that. So.
Yeah. My favorite basically is you seventh graders could Google it. It's called plantain. It's a Plantain. It's like a banana, but it's not really.
Kind of
It's a
like
root shape
it's a little bit like a banana, kind of with like a potato too,
something
a
like
little
that.
bit.
Yeah.
It's not as sweet as like a
Correct.
normal banana.
Correct. So
Yeah, you can get them around here.
yeah,
They
yeah,
sell,
and
they sell
they
them.
have some of them. If you go, you can get plant. So it will be plantain and a vegetable. This vegetable is actually called bitter leaf, like a leaf that's bitter because it's a very bitter leaf. But what we do is we get it and then put spices there, some salt and everything, and it's wonderful when you put all those together. So yeah, so plantain and bitter leaf. That's my favorite. I miss it so much. My favorite dish in West Africa.
Okay, so the next question is from Caitlin, and she asked, "How did you get around?" And I think what they're curious about is like public transportation a big thing? Do people own their own cars? Is it even traveling between countries? Is there like rail service between countries, like all over Europe, or is it kind of more of a sort of what you would traditionally think of like Jeeps and Land Rovers getting across these sort of somewhat intimidating landscapes or something like that. How do people get around just day to day, or if they want to travel quite a bit?
People around Africa cross continentally, like people traveling from one African country to the other. Most of them use planes. So we have every country has its own plane. For example, in Nigeria, you have the Nigeria Airways. In Cameroon, we have the Cameroonian Airlines. And South Africa has a couple of airlines. So the main um, main way of transportation from one African country to the other is through plane, so flying. We also have the cars. There are cars because, again, as you said earlier, some African countries, as you saw in the map, really they live, it's landlocked. So they live, two countries, three countries could be in the same area. I've actually taken a car ride from Nigeria to Ghana. It takes 2 days, and I happen to move through two different countries. The country called Togo and the country called Benin. So two African countries. So you have Togo, Benin, and you have so Togo, Benin, and then you have Nigeria. Then you have Nigeria. So if you're going from Ghana to Nigeria, you pass through Togo and Benin, two countries. Just an example to show you how a lot of these countries are really together. So yeah, so a car, that's a lot of people use that, but most of the time, because again, it took me 2 days, people use they fly, use the plane.
And then just getting around like Yaoundé, right? If you are going from place to place, did your family have a car that you guys would utilize, or was it buses, or with a city that small, it seems like probably a lot of individual car ownership and people having family cars and stuff, but it's maybe not one of the things that people think of there. Um, Another question from Emily V here. She wants to know just kind of what kind of chores and things you had to do. Were they sort of similar to what American teens having over here? Or is there some other things that you would have to handle?
You'll have to the family in Cameroon, and I can speak for a lot of the African countries. It's very very chore oriented. I don't think that in the United States. I mean, I've lived here for a bit, and I've spend time with families, I don't think um, they do as much chores as I did growing up. And again, I know there's some American families who pride themselves in chores, so the kids, do a lot of chores. But from a very large standpoint, I think the African family we do a lot of chores. Some of the chores we do a lot of cleaning, cleaning the house. We do a lot of, and it's changing now, but most of the chores are manual. In other words, you have to, for example, we don't really have lawnmowers to mow the lawn, so you have to use machetes and actually manually take off the grass. So it's really intensive. I think it's changing because Africa is slowly getting technologically enhanced. The technology is improving every year. But the chores we do. I mean, for example, I'll give you one. This is a pretty typical example. In the United States, a lot of meals, right, are prepared in 2, 4, 5 minutes. I mean, it's quick. You want to make a meal, it's there for you.
Yeah, if we would make it at all, right?
Yeah, if you would make it at all. Back home, the average time to make a meal is 2 hours, and it involves a lot of people. So the kids, the parents, sometimes the grandparents, and that's how much the average meal takes. So just to give you kind of an idea of how intense the chores are.
Yeah, that was going to be my question about the meal preparation and stuff. I was going to ask if the kids were involved with that, but you kind of answered that. Now, this is a question from Caden, and his question is, what was your family's job? But instead of you could answer that question personally too, but also, what is a typical job for someone from Cameroon or in Western Africa, right? Because a lot of our students here, they grow up on family farms or are involved in farming in some way. So what is the economy like in Cameroon? I mean, what are people mostly employed in?
Well, you'll be I don't know if you'd be surprised, seventh graders to know, but actually the primary way people are employed in not only in Cameroon, I think in a lot of Africa, is farming. Farming is a big employ. People are mostly employed doing farm work. But we also have, again, as I said earlier, with Africa developing every single year, we're now having other jobs, office jobs. Africa is getting oil and getting telecommunication. So with Africa moving towards the technology area, it has created more and more diverse work options. But farming still remains in most of the continent as a big employer. So in Cameroon, I have uncles who are pig farmers who work in the farm. I actually, growing up, would work in the farm. Obviously, not I wasn't paid, but I would work and assist in the farm. So I'm used to a lot of farm work. But my parents, my dad happens to be a teacher, a professor in a university, and my mom works for the United Nations. So that's my family's background. But that being said, again, I worked a lot. I actually did a lot of farm work. I also did a lot of construction work because we're building, again, as I said, homes and everything. So I was heavily involved in that. So the last thing, again, to answer your question, is a typical job for anybody back home would be to work in a farm.
Yeah, a wide variety of jobs, just like you'd expect in a city with 100,000 plus people, right? They're going to be doing a lot of different things. The next question comes from Aiden, and his question is, how hard is it to live there? So you kind of touched on it a little bit, but you said that the coldest it gets down to is about 40 degrees there, which is pretty mild. But what about, like, as far as heat, humidity? Is it difficult there? Is air conditioning even prevalent in a lot of places? Just what's it like living in a climate that is much different than what you experience now, except for in the summer, right?
Yeah.
It's pretty hot here.
Yeah. It's beautiful. It's sometimes some countries like in Ghana it gets really hot, gets about 120, 125. So I know in Egypt it can get around that level. So that's a little intense, as you can imagine. Um, but what's it like? It's nice. Africans are extraordinarily outdoor people, and in the United States and Europe, you're outdoorsy when the weather is good. So, but when the weather is not as good, it limits your outdoor options. But because of our climate, we're extremely outdoorsy. And it helps us. Our climate helps us with our day-to-day activities because we're always mobile, and we don't Africa we don't people don't have access to cars that much, so it's not a very uh, affluent community as some European countries or as the United States would be. So the mode of movement, mobility is walking. You have to walk from place to place, but that's what most people do. That's what I did growing up. I walked sometimes for an hour and a half. It's not unusual to see people walk. So, as it would be in probably in the United States because most people have cars. So to facilitate what makes that walking easier is of course the weather patterns. So again, um, without continuing to explain, our living back home is it's great. It facilitates our day-to-day activities. It makes our lives, the way we move around, a lot easier. And when it gets so hot, people stay home because I mean it could be a health hazard, the extreme heat. But for the most part, it's temperate, and we can do our day-to-day activities.
Okay, so speaking of day-to-day activities, the next question comes from Janelle, and she asks, "What was a common game to play growing up in Cameroon or some of the other places?" So you already said soccer is big, and these guys know that I know you through soccer and stuff. So that's a big one. But what other types of games or something like that, sports or other things did people get involved with, as you were growing up?
Cards. We played a lot of cards. Actually, if I wasn't running around, of course, as you said, playing soccer, I would play a lot of cards. That was a big, very low key kind of game we would play. Um,
So if it's like
yeah,
110
but
degrees and you don't want to play
yeah,
soccer, you're gonna
110
play
degrees.
cards.
Yeah, we'll play cards. Yeah.
What about this is from me sort of following up on that, like the idea of like board games like Monopoly and stuff like that. Did that stuff carry over to Cameroon or Western Africa? Did people play like Monopoly or some of those other board games, or is it mostly cards, dice stuff, maybe dominoes, stuff like that? Um,
Yeah, it was mostly dice. It was mostly dice. The people who had Monopoly were Africans who could afford it. So since again, very, it's not a very affluent um, continent, I guess. No, we played mostly dice games, simple things that didn't require you to spend a lot of money on.
All right, so a couple of these questions looks like we've already answered before, but Alyssa asked kind of an interesting question, and she asked about like the currency or the type of money that is used over in Cameroon or Nigeria. They don't really have, I don't think, they don't really have like a euro type situation where there's a common currency amongst a large group of African nations. So you could talk about specifically the type of currency that they use there, but then is it difficult to sort of travel across these borders and use, have different currency and stuff? So,
In Africa is divided. If you seventh graders didn't know, we have different sections. You have Central Africa, you have Northern Africa, you have Southern Africa, not just the country South Africa. You have Southern Africa, which has a couple of African countries. Then, of course, where I'm from, you have West Africa. What we've, what these regions have decided to do is have a currency system that would facilitate. If you are in Nigeria, you can be able to change. You can be able to change your currency from the Nigerian currency to the Cameroonian currency. The Nigerian currency is called the naira. So, and then the Cameroonian currency is called the CFA. So, if you went from Nigeria to Cameroon, you could change your naira to CFA and be able to use that currency in Cameroon, and of course, vice versa. The the France has a stronghold in the economics, and which involves currency of some African countries. So Cameroon happened to be a former French colony, so we use the CFA. Togo, another French currency, another French colony uses the CFA. You have Senegal. There are a couple of there are a list of African countries who were colonized by the French who would use the CFA. So, but a lot of the other countries are independent. So Nigeria uses the naira. Uh, Ghana uses the cedis. Um, yeah, so they're independent. They have their own unique currency. But the currency, and this is I would respond to this question as well from a global perspective. Uh, I think globally, like if some of you seventh graders don't know, you have the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. So this a this is an agency that responds to different currency because people are always traveling. People have their own currency. So how do you create some sort of currency so that people can change it if they go from one area to the other, cross continentally. So they address this kind of issues. So it's not at all difficult for Africans with their currency to be able to move from somewhere to another and then change their currency. It's not, yeah, it's actually,
Sounds like it might be a little bit inconvenient if you have to go someplace to get it exchanged, but
yes,
but
yeah.
it's not impossible, right? And we talked about this a little bit just recently with the 5 yen piece that I had shown them, right? We took a look at that, and the 5 yen piece is worth like 5 cents approximately in that range. So we've looked a little bit at currency conversion. Now Megan has a couple of questions that are kind of interesting here, and maybe you can try to address them both. They're kind of pop culture questions. So she asks about like the type of clothes that people wear. Sometimes we get this image of the African wearing like a dashiki type thing with the loose garments and stuff like that. So she asked about the clothes, but then she also asked what kind of music is sort of popular in Western Africa, and in Africa in general. You can speak to your experience there. So if you want to try to handle those two questions.
Yeah, we do wear the same clothing as you would wear in America. I think um, clothing now is interesting. There's a lot of Western influence all across the world. So I think all across the world you can see people wear similar clothing. But to be more specific, yes, we do have the dashiki style. We of course we have another name, but yeah, that's what it is. We do have that. People wear that a lot. Growing up personally, I wore, and most of my co friends, we wore mostly like, clothes that you guys would wear here, shirts, everything. That's what we wore. I know that in different localities and more indigenous localities, they have different clothes that they wear. So yeah, I guess the clothing is different even in Cameroon per se. But a lot of my friends, the people I knew, just wore normal uh, clothing that you would wear here. Music, we most of our music it has a little bit of hip hop uh, taste, but if you want to look at African music, it's it's a lot of it is influenced in Latin America. So if you listen to Shakira, and interestingly, Shakira's song um, during the World Cup. I mean, what
Yeah,
is the
yeah.
song? Yeah,
It's like Waka
Waka
Waka.
Waka.
Yeah, yeah.
Interestingly, that song Shakira Waka Waka is Cameroonian. It's the original song is from my country, Cameroon. So that would give you a kind of a sense of African music. So yeah, so if you listen to Waka Waka, there you go. You have kind of your taste of African music there.
Um, One of the things that we're sort of running out of time here because you and I have to get to playing soccer pretty soon here. But one of the things that I want to give you a chance to do is just sort of, if you want people to know, well, just a couple of things about Africa, because we have talked about before, kind of what we see coming out of Africa is um, different aspects of the culture than probably what a good percentage of the population that live in Africa sort of experience, right? The stuff that we hear out of Africa is primarily the wilderness stuff, like the giraffes, the rhinos, the safari type situation, right? Unfortunately, we also hear quite a bit about stuff that's going on in Egypt or with Boko Haram in Nigeria, right? Or some of the other areas where the news isn't necessarily good about what's coming out of Africa. But what do you kind of want seventh graders and others to know, like what's Africa like? What do you want people to know about Africa so that we can sort of get a real picture of what Africa's like?
Africa is a continent that is very complex, and Africa is also a continent that I think people are very confused about. I just want to say one thing that I think is my personality too, and I've talked about it Ryan a lot. I would like you seventh graders to understand that as much as Africa is a very confusing continent, people don't know or people have their own version of Africa. I would like to say that a lot of continents are also a little confusing. I know in Africa, a lot of people in Africa feel that the people in the United States are all rich. They all have a lot of money. They're all doing very, very well. They all have blonde hair. You understand? And I mean, that's what I'm saying. It's very confusing because it's not true. If they came to the United States, they would realize the United States is a little complex. So I just wanted, again, I wanted to share with you, the seventh graders, to try and help you as you're growing up to also to understand that a lot of the notions about Africa, people also have those notions about other places because, again, as I said, it's it's not entirely accurate that everybody in the United States is rich and has blonde hair. So so that being said, I guess I can be really brief. That being said, I want to say that Africa is really it's a wonderful place. It's a very diverse. Apparently, experts say it's one of the most diverse places in terms of mankind. You can trace a lot of different human DNA from our continent. Um, I would like to say we it's a place where we really think about community. We really um, and put emphasis on how we can relate to each other, how we can work together. We put a lot of emphasis in community, which I've seen in South Dakota to say, and that's what I've enjoyed with South Dakota. People say hi and everything, little sorts of things like that. And in Africa, you see that all the time. The community and then food. The food that we have is really great, and and then sports. So I want to say it's a really, really wonderful place. It's a place that is growing every day as well. It's developing. If you were to visit Africa in the next, any country in Africa in the next 20 years, it'll be very, very different. And but again, just to go back to my first point, I would like to share with all of you seventh graders that um, it's it's like any other place. It has its differences, and it has its positives, its negatives. But it's just an incredible place, and I would really like you to visit countries there: South Africa, Egypt, Cameroon. It's just for you to get your own um, true picture. But I think you would really enjoy it, and I'm really happy to be from a country in Africa.
All right. Well, that's going to do it for us here. I'm sure at this point you're going to all give JP a round of applause, and I will let him know how much you all enjoyed it. So, thanks for visiting with us, JP.
Thank you, thank you. I hope you guys have a great summer. I'm very happy to do this, and maybe if Ryan has any other questions, I could come talk to you again. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, no problem. Thanks again, JP.